Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to see such a large audience for these kind of fundamental issues that aren't so policy oriented, but I think are very important. So this is joint work with Casper and based on work that Alberto has also been a part of, and Eileen Tippo, who's at Queen Mary, and Michael Plant. And then the other co-authors on this project are Caroline Brett and Maya Nolan, who are at Liverpool John Moores University. What's the motivation for this project? So I guess we have two main motivations. So the first one is, as Casper just mentioned, the kind of portion of the variance that we can explain with the questions that are currently available in social surveys for life satisfaction seems to be quite low. And that suggests to us that maybe there's some things that are really determinative of life satisfaction that we're just not asking people about. So a quick way to solve that problem, or to make a start on it, is to just ask people, like, what determines your life satisfaction? We've generally avoided that in the past because we're worried about cognitive biases and this sort of thing, which is reasonable, but I think there's no reason not to have one go at it and see what comes out in the wash. The second issue is about measurement. So we typically we need to make three assumptions when we're running regressions into this data. So the first one is linearity, essentially that the intervals, the amount of life satisfaction between the points on someone's scales is broadly of the same magnitude or the same size. Intertemporal consistency, so respondents are using their scales in the same way over time, and interpersonal consistency, which is that different people use the scales essentially the same way. Now, usually in the past, when we've brought up these kind of issues as a concern, and I guess mainstream economists are very skeptical with relation to these three things, usually you get psychometric validity as the response. So you say like, well, life satisfaction correlates with income and it went down during the COVID pandemic, so therefore these metrics are valid and we don't really need to worry about it beyond that. And we're broadly on board with psychometric validity, so it's not a question that life satisfaction scales can't be used. This is more of an issue of precision. So there are some applications, particularly as we move into the policy domain, where precision really becomes quite critical. And so to understand to what extent these assumptions are credible, if they are violated, how severe are those violations in practice, how much do they change results, that sort of stuff, it seems to be important for us to understand how people are using their scales. We have developed a whole range of methodologies to try to work that out, and this is the first of those methodologies, which is qualitative. So we're going to ask people, how do you use your scales? So what determines your life satisfaction? How do you use your scale? All right. We have quite a large sort of formal structure operating in the background, but I won't go into it because I didn't think this was really the audience for that. But basically, starting just with Andrew Oswald's framework of a reporting function. So you have people's life satisfaction assessments. You could think of this as their latent life satisfaction. And then there is some cognitive, emotional, social, and linguistic process by which they map these underlying life satisfaction assessments into a scale response. And we're interested in understanding that function. So there are at least 4 things that people need to do as part of this process. So they need to think about what lives to consider. What are the things that determine your satisfaction? How are they going to rank those different considerations to form a ranking of lives? How do they map that ranking into the response categories that are available on the scale questions? There might be 10, there might be 4, there might be 100. And then which of those response categories do they choose? So just to give you a sense for how this might factor into econometric issues, so we have assume that you have the same individual here, so they have the same life, they make the same latent life satisfaction assumptions, all that's different is their reporting function. So in particular, this person varies on the left-hand side and the right-hand side by how they map that underlying life satisfaction into the scale response categories. So in this case, you have L star, which is the person's actual life, and this person is mapping it down into a 6, and this person with the exact same latent life satisfaction assessments instead maps it into an 8. So as a researcher, we would think that this person has much higher life satisfaction, but that's in fact erroneous. What they have is a different reporting function. So we want to understand whether these reporting functions do vary this dramatically, and whether this is some kind of problem that we should be looking into. All right, so how do we go about this methodologically? Just one slide here. So we're intending to interview, in the first instance, 100 residents of England, but we might push that up to 400. The objective is conceptual saturation. So when you're doing qualitative work, you don't really want a representative sample. That's not so interesting. What you actually want is to keep interviewing people until you stop getting new information. And then after that, you will start to think about representatives. So we're looking for conceptual saturation in the first instance, so we're really looking to interview diverse people, and we try quite hard to purposefully sample people who are different from the people we've already sampled. So far, we've only done 22 interviews, so this is very early stages. Interviews are about half an hour long. We pay people the London living wage for an hour of their time, because there's some administrative stuff either side. We have quite a diverse sample on age, gender, sexuality, income, occupation, and education, but to date we're not diverse at all really on race and culture or rural metropolitan. Cool. So I'll start with some encouraging findings that I think sort of support the work that's gone on already in the last 40 years or whatever of this research. So people seem to reflect mostly on themselves when they're thinking about their life satisfaction, not on society at large. There might be a cultural thing to do with the UK. So once we've done this, we might go and interview some people in Japan or Africa, see if it's different. They typically think society is doing worse than they are, so that doesn't seem to affect their personal life satisfaction that much. People interpret possible in the Cantrell's ladder question, best possible life for you, worst possible life for you, quite realistically. So they don't think about being a rock star or Jeff Bezos or something like that. They usually have something reasonable in mind. People's emotions and recent events don't seem to affect their answers very much. This almost gets to the point of being problematic. So I had two respondents, one whose father had had a heart attack 3 days prior to the interview, and one person whose mother had been hospitalized the week before. And I said, have these events affected your life satisfaction? They're like, no, not really. So I'm like, okay, I don't know about that. All right. The meaning of the points on the scale changes quite frequently. So when I ask people to reflect on what determined their satisfaction 5 years ago versus today, often it's quite different things. But what they do to solve what we call the ranking problem, which is how they organize different considerations in their life into a ranking, that seems to be broadly stable over time. And I find that very encouraging. People don't change their scores after deliberation. So the last question in the survey is, after all the conversation we've been having, are you thinking about your life differently? Are you thinking about the way you use the scale differently? And would you like to change your answer? And only one person so far has said that they would, went up by 1 point. I also find that people's understanding of what life satisfaction means to them doesn't change after deliberation, and nor does best worst possible life. All right. What does well-being mean broadly to people? I would say this is really qualitative research now, so I'm sort of coding the data and trying to find what themes are emerging, so this is a pretty rough cut. But basically people seem to talk about having a solid, steady state, which is about having enough income, health, and education to do the things that you want to do, and then having good relationships. Those are kind of the two key things. And then beyond that steady state, you have various projects and various things that keep your life dynamic and exciting. So things like business ventures, self-improvement, expanding the garden, that sort of thing. I think we do quite a good job of measuring this in social surveys. This stuff I think we do a much poorer job of, so we could think about how to integrate that a bit better. Things that affect well-being that aren't in social surveys, they are to some extent in the European Social Survey, especially in the 2012 well-being module, but I think otherwise not much. Access to intensive and extensive therapy, so a lot of the people I'm working with so far have histories of trauma, and it's really important to them to have really quite extensive and thorough psychotherapy. Having projects, as I mentioned. The quality of relationships is absolutely critical. So not really the quantity of them, but how good they are. So just to give you one example, I had a respondent say, a hugely transformative experience for me is that earlier this year, I realized that I just didn't need to talk to my dad anymore, and I stopped speaking to him. And that has been revolutionary for my well-being. So that's kind of, I hope, driving home a lot of these issues. Enough money and time to do the things that you want to do. It's not clear to me that satisfaction with finances necessarily captures that. A clear sense of self, including the ambitions and goals that you want to meet, like the kind of person you want to become. Administrative burdens and cognitive load. So just like, there's this joke that I love on Twitter where it's like, the reason why you have this midlife dip in middle age is because you have to start worrying about like your taxes and where your birth certificate is and things like that. Self-esteem, the sense that you're on a positive trajectory. So I think maybe we can capture that with optimism, but it'd be worth looking at it deeper. And then trauma and how to think about trauma in the context of social surveys. Right, let me just focus on two, I think, quite significant findings so far for econometric issues. So this is to give you a sense for how one of the questions we use to investigate how people are using their scales. So we have a whole bunch of questions, but this is one we developed that we can employ in a qualitative setting because we can explain it to people. So when you first see it, you might think there's no way people are grasping this, but I can discuss that with them and they do seem to get it. So what we do is we say, okay, these are different graphical representations of how you might be using your scale. So the black line through the middle, this one here, is your life satisfaction. The dot represents where this person is in terms of their satisfaction. The brackets are then the points on the scale and what parts of life satisfaction they correspond to. So in this person's case, they say that they are 7 out of 10. There could be other ways of using your scale. So we always prime people with linearity. So I think linearity is an assumption. So I don't want to imply that I'm manipulating people away from linearity. So we start with linearity. We say you could have even intervals between the points on your scale. But you might also have something like small increments of satisfaction around your current level and wider increments as you move away from that level. You might have large increments where you are and smaller increments elsewhere. You might just have something quite chaotic like this, where it's just sort of very different intervals at different points on your scale. And then we also have convex and concave, so big at the top, small at the bottom, and vice versa. Now, most people do seem to think that that is a reasonable graphical representation of their scale, which kind of surprised me. A few people have said that's just like not how I was thinking about it, something like that. But broadly, people seem to think this is reasonable. The most common scale shape is not linearity. About 10% of people say that they use linearity. About 50% of people, have this shape. So small increments of satisfaction to move around their current level, wide increments elsewhere. Another maybe 15% of people say that they are skinny in the middle and wide at the ends. There's a consideration here about how this affects econometrics. So we're still thinking about this and formally modeling it, but as a kind of motivation for why this could be problematic, you have the same person here at 2 points in time, or two different people at the same point in time with the same reporting style. So they both have this skinny around where they are, wide elsewhere. You can see that this person's latent life satisfaction is higher than this person's. And the researcher will correctly observe that to some extent because this person will report a 6 and this person will report a 5. But at the same time, this person's 4 is higher than that person's 5. And so this might be kind of biasing our estimates to some extent. And this is the kind of issues that I raised at the beginning around whether these instruments are precise as opposed to whether they are psychometrically valid. One nice thing is that we find it would be very difficult to get a sign reversal in this context. So it's really about whether the coefficients are biased or not. Second kind of key finding, I think, in a policy context is that overwhelmingly, so I haven't updated this for the next 5 people that we interviewed, but almost all respondents say that they would never give a 10 out of 10 and that they can only see themselves giving a 9 out of 10 for a couple of days at most around major achievements. Those people who do say that they could see themselves giving a 9 or a 10 have very modest lives in mind for that, like strikingly modest lives for what a 10 out of 10 is. This accords with some recent rash analysis showing that life satisfaction scale use is quite consistent up till about 8 out of 10, and then it starts to get a bit strange. I think the main implication of this is twofold. So in the UK, according to the 2018 annual population survey, average life satisfaction was 7.7 out of 10. So if you're thinking of life satisfaction maximization as the objective of policy, and you're already at 8 out of 10, and people say they won't give a higher number, then are you perhaps setting yourself up to fail? And secondly, that treatments that interact with a population who have a high baseline, so if you're trying to improve life satisfaction among people who start at 8 out of 10, then you may observe no treatment effect. But if you ask people directly, did that policy improve your life satisfaction, they will say, yeah, it was great. Keep doing that. Because they have this high baseline, they've got no space to move in their scale. I think similarly, if you're working with people who are low in their life satisfaction, then you'll see really big effects. And you might get the wrong idea between comparing those policies. Okay, so to conclude, very keen to hear ways to improve the study. It's very early days. I think broadly we need to be a bit less chauvinistic about quantitative methods. I say that as someone who mostly does quant and who's very positivist. But I think qualitative methods have a really big role to play in life satisfaction research and wellbeing research more generally. I think we need to take the peculiarities of scale use more seriously. I think there is a tendency in our field to circle the wagons around this stuff and just kind of keep doing business as usual. I think we should instead meet this challenge head on. So, what could go wrong with these scales? How to investigate whether that is in fact going wrong, and then let's try to have a more robust understanding of what we're doing. We shouldn't keep leaning on psychometric validity. Psychometric validity is great, but let's think about precision. I think qualitative research can help us interpret quantitative results, so can theory. I think qualitative research can provide really rich hypotheses about what well-being is. So we should start with that and then test it quantitatively instead of trying to derive a rich hypothesis from quite superficial data. I'll just end there. Thanks very much.